All right. 2 Chronicles chapter number 8. 2 Chronicles chapter 8 is where we're located, and if you study out and begin to look all through scriptures about Solomon and the time period that it took Solomon to build the temple, it took him about half of the time that he was king to get it completed. So it took quite some time. I mean, it wasn't something that was completed in 2 or 3 months. It wasn't something that was completed in a year. It took several years for him to complete the temple. And but once he had completed that, and it shares with us here in the first verse of chapter 8. It took about 20 years. Right close to 20 years for him to complete the temple. So, but we'll get into verse 1, chapter number 8. And it came to pass at the end of 20 years, wherein Solomon had built the house of the Lord and his own house. So, and now a king is not going to build a 3-bedroom house and, living room, kitchen. They're going to have a palace. So, between both of them, between the temple and his house, and then, he's not only building houses for himself, he's building houses for wives, because Solomon's one that had multiple wives, and we'll eventually see how many, but he had a pile of them. But, Solomon, he didn't get in a hurry because he wanted these things done right. So, but it took him the better part of 20 years to build the temple and his house. That the cities which Hiram had restored to Solomon, Solomon built them and caused the children of Israel to dwell there. So, now, once all this is complete, we're seeing really an enlargement of the territory that Solomon has under his realm. And, and we'll see here that some of these places, went from around Lebanon all the way down to right at the edge of Egypt. At one time, Israel covered a little bit bigger area than what they do right now. So, and Solomon went to Hamath Zobah and prevailed against it. And this is, it was such a small battle that, it was nothing really for him to complete. I mean, it was an easy battle. But, don't get me wrong. God could have taken this small group of people and defeated Solomon, if that's what God would have wanted to do. But, it's and this is probably the only time that I can remember in all my readings of anything that Solomon did up to this point, war-wise. So, actually up to this point, he had done none. So, but he did prevail against Hamath Zobah and to enlarge his territory. And he built Tadmor in the wilderness and all the store cities which he built in Hamath, which were supply depots. Once you get out away from Jerusalem, be kind of tough if you're several miles away to get back to get supplies. So he built supply depots around the area so that, whichever direction they went in, they would have plenty, whatever they needed. So, and that's what he did at Tadmor and other store cities. Also, he built Beth Horon the upper, and Beth Horon the nether, which is the lower, fenced cities with walls, gates, and bars. kind of sounds like prison colonies, kind of, he's putting walls and gates and bars and, but I don't find where it shares that these were prison colonies. So, but it just could have been the area that they were in that there was a lot of ungodly people. Because and we're going to see here that there were still people in the area that Israel should have destroyed when they came into the promised land. But they didn't. They didn't do what God said, and it's going to come back to haunt them. And and that's sad, but that's the price you pay when you don't obey God. When God tells us to do something, He wants us to do it 100% of what He said. Not halfway. If you do something halfway, then, it's going to come back to haunt you. And that's what's going to happen with these people that they didn't just totally destroy. But they ran up into the mountains, a lot of caves and things in the hills around throughout Israel. And these people would run and hide in these caves, and the Israelites, well, we've got most of them. They didn't worry about them. But now, there's a bunch of them. And Baaloth and all the store cities that Solomon had, and all the chariot cities, and the cities of the horsemen, and all that Solomon desired to build in Jerusalem and in Lebanon, and throughout all the land of his dominion. So, the land of his dominion went from Lebanon all the way down to the edge of Egypt. And but now, and if we go all the way back to the book of Genesis, where God had promised Abraham, wherever your foot has trod, that's the land I'm going to give you. And if you reread those scriptures in the book of Genesis, you'll find that it went all the way to the Tigris-Euphrates River, went all the way north it would have encompassed all of Lebanon and Syria, and then southward, Jordan, parts of Saudi Arabia, and then all the way over to the edge of Egypt, which would include the Sinai Peninsula, was once a part of Israel, what God had promised them. Now, at different times, they've had different amounts of land in history. And but right now, they have really a small portion. It might be the size of, it's probably a little bigger than Rhode Island, but it's not a whole lot bigger. And, but all the Arabs over there want them out of there. They don't want them to have that land. So, and we see a lot of turmoil in that area right regularly with bombs and all kind of stuff going on in the Middle East. So, and we'll continue to see that until God says it's enough. So, but he goes on about Solomon. He says, as for all the people that were left of the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, which were not of Israel, but of their children who were left after them in the land, whom the children of Israel consumed not, them did Solomon make to pay tribute until this day. So, instead of annihilating these people at the beginning like God told him to do, God told him when he would give them a portion of the promised land, God told them what to do. God told them to go in, and he told them to just utterly destroy everything, or either he would tell them they could keep some of the flocks, some of the cattle, and the silver and gold. But then there were those that he told them just totally destroy everything. He told them to keep nothing. Don't keep the gold, silver, or nothing. And, there was a problem with a man that took some of it and buried it in his tent. And the Israelites began to have trouble. And God shared with Moses their sin in the camp. And they began to search it out, and they found, and I cannot remember the man's name, but they found the gold was buried under his tent. And when they found it, him and all of his family were destroyed. They were killed because that family had brought trouble to all of Israel because of it. So, but these people here are going to trouble the Israelite people because they left portions of these people, and now the ones that they'd left behind, it's their children that they're dealing with now. And instead of, God, do you want us to destroy them now? Solomon makes them really like slaves. You're going to pay tribute. You're going to pay taxes. You're going to do whatever we need for the Israelite people, for the Jewish people. He says, but of the children of Israel did Solomon make no servants for his work, but they were men of war and chief of his captains and captains of his chariots and horsemen. So, none of Israel did Solomon choose out to be slaves, because he was the king and he could take anybody's children that was old enough, that were old enough to be fighters or whatever, or work in his palace or whatever he wanted. He could take them, but he didn't. He took none of the children of Israel to be servants for his work. So, but he did take them to be men of war. He took them to be captains and as chief captains and horsemen to run his chariots. So, Solomon, you won't read a whole lot of troubles that he was involved with, because God told David, as long as Solomon will do what I say, he won't have to worry about being on a battlefield. But now with this battle that took place here, Solomon was not actually on the battlefield. So, but David was. When David was king, he was on the battlefield with them. He was killing folks just right alongside his soldiers. And that's why he could not build the temple. But God told him, your son will build the temple, and it won't be one that goes out to battle. So, but Solomon was prepared. It'd be kind of crazy not to be prepared. I mean, God can take care of everything, don't get me wrong, but and I know that, but it wouldn't be a real smart king that wouldn't be prepared for folks that might want to try you out. So he had folks that were ready to go to battle. And these were the chief of King Solomon's officers, even 250, that bear rule over the people. So he had 250 men that were his officers, and they were over all of the army and the people. So, as big as Israel is, and as scattered out as it is, that's really not a lot of people to help rule over them. but you had enough people you could get messages out to everybody else if it needed be, for whatever would arise. But Solomon was one that he was prepared, but rarely had to use it. And Solomon brought up the daughter of Pharaoh out of the city of David into the house that he had built for her. For he said, my wife shall not dwell in the house of David, king of Israel, because the places are holy, whereunto the ark of the Lord hath come. So, in here we see Solomon is married to a daughter of Pharaoh. Way back we read where God did not want the Israelite people intermarrying with other folks in this area. And the reason was because the Gentile people were worshiping so many other false gods that God knew that if you take one of those as your wife, or one of their men take one of your daughters as their wife, somebody's changing. And I've had people before to tell me, well, it really shouldn't matter who I marry. If I'm a Christian, I can change them to what I am. But more times than not, that non-Christian will pull a Christian out of church. That happens more times than it doesn't happen. So, you have to be careful. And, the Bible plainly shares if we're a born-again Christian, we need to marry a Christian. I mean, that's, a lot of people may not like that and may not want to hear that, but that's, in the New Testament, Paul shares about the 6th chapter, I think it is, of 2 Corinthians. He shares there that, what fellowship has light with darkness. And what he's sharing about there is relationships. If I'm a part of the light, if I'm a born-again Christian, what fellowship have I got with darkness? And meaning coming together to marry. What kind of fellowship is that going to be? That one that's the non-Christian, once they start fussing because you're getting up every Sunday morning going to Sunday school and church or whatever, Wednesday nights going to church and, oh, my supper ain't ready, or you're not eating my supper and whatever, and, that'll begin to wear on a person. And then all the fussing and the yan-yan, and then a lot of times they'll start staying home. I know because I've been right there. Sonia was which neither one of us were saved when we got married. But she got saved a good little while before I did. And you know what happened? I began to hinder her from going to church. I mean, I hate that now. I can't go back and change that. But I did. And, I'm an example of that. A non-Christian will pull a Christian down in a relationship every time. It's sad. But I'm glad she didn't give up on me. We stuck it out. But another reason, God had told him not to intermarry, but here Solomon has the daughter of Pharaoh as his wife. He didn't want to leave her in David's palace back in Jerusalem, or in Jerusalem. They're still in Jerusalem, but he said wherever the Ark of the Covenant's been is a holy place. And that Ark of the Covenant had been at David's house, behind his house under a tent. So, he's looking at that as a holy place, even though he was not doing one thing that God had said, and that was to marry Jewish people. Then Solomon offered burnt offerings unto the Lord on the altar of the Lord, which he had built before the porch. So, You know, one thing that Solomon, we'll keep reading somewhat about Solomon is, he did offer a lot of burnt offerings. He offered things to God for people. And, as I read that, I thought about, it came to my heart and mind about Job. In the first chapter of the book of Job, his children, he would offer offerings every morning for him and his wife and his children. He said, peradventure, they have sinned against God. So he would offer offerings for them. And, Solomon is, they've got to have a bunch of sheep and cattle and, to be able to continually offer these offerings.
We wouldn't have anything to eat if we did that today.
I'll tell you what, we've been a world of trouble. Even after a certain rate every day, so there was a certain rate that he would offer every single day to God, offering according to the commandment of Moses on the Sabbaths and on the new moons and on the solemn feasts 3 times in a year, even in the feasts of unleavened bread and in the feast of weeks and in the feast of tabernacles. So, every feast that came up, every new moon that came up, every Sabbath that came up, they were offering a certain amount of offerings every time. And all these different feasts happened 3 times a year. So you're offering a pile of animals, shedding blood, and offering a sacrifice to God. So all these things, there's no telling how many, whatever, the Bible, I don't find anywhere it shares what the rate was every day that they offered. There was a bunch of it. And he appointed according to the order of David his father. And David, before David died, he had appointed people for every part of the worship services and everything that needed to be done. And now Solomon is following through with those same appointments. He appointed according to the order of David his father the courses of the priests to their service, because all the Levites were the priestly line. But now, not all of them were able to be the high priest. Not all of them were able to be the chief priests. There were so many different responsibilities of the Levites. So, the courses of the priests to their service and the Levites to their charges. So, the Levites had several different administrations in being the priestly line. And here's some of them: to be priest, and then to praise and minister before the priest as the duty of every day required. So, they were singers, they were musicians, and they were to minister to the priests. In other words, they needed to make sure that the priest's offerings were offered and all this kind. Because now, especially the high priest, he better make sure he was prayed up, packed up, and ready to go when he went inside that Holy of Holies. Because if he didn't, he was not coming out alive.
They were going to have to drag him out.
They were going to have to drag him out with the rope they had tied around him. They didn't hear the little bells on the bottom of his garment jingling. They'd wait a little bit, and if they didn't hear anything, no doubt they would call out to him. If they didn't answer, they'd start pulling him out with that rope, because they couldn't go in. Then they'd have to appoint a new high priest. So, but he better make sure he's prayed up, packed up, and ready to go. But the Levites, their charges were to praise, to minister before the priest, as the duty of every day required. This was something that had to be done every single day. The porters also by their courses at every gate. For so had David, the man of God, commanded. Because, every part of coming into the temple, And, you know, if you want to see this book, shows a lot of gates and all this kind of stuff. But, you know, wherever there was a gate, wherever, you know, people could congregate and get from one place to another in the temple, they had Levites there over those gates, over those doorways, over, you know, just directing people where to go. So, you know, it was a big undertaking, and it took that whole tribe of Levi to do this. Or else God would have had to taken the firstborn of every family to do this responsibility. So, you know, we serve an awesome God. We serve a God that's way yonder smarter than we are. We'd have probably been knotheads and said, let's take the firstborn of every family. You know, that would grow kind of like, who do we get next? Did we already get that one? You know, but if you take the whole tribe of Levi, you don't have to worry about that. Which God could do it now, don't get me wrong. God's smart enough and wise enough. He would know who to take and choose and all that kind of stuff. But man getting involved in it, yeah, we'd make a mess of it. So God just said, hey, you know what? I'll take the whole tribe of Levi. There won't be any problems now. So, and God knew what he was doing. But these same things, David had appointed these folks to these same positions before he died. And Solomon is just going through with that appointment, that type schedule that his daddy had set up is what he's going through with. And they departed not from the commandment of the king unto the priests and Levites concerning any matter or concerning the treasures. So everything, they didn't waver in what they had, the way it was set up to operate and everything to fall in place. They didn't waver from it. They didn't get over here and say, well, I think this way would be better and this way. They didn't do that. They didn't deviate from the way God had set it up. Because the appointments that David made, God was pleased with. I feel like, and I believe with all my heart, that God had instructed David. God was leading David how to set these appointments up so that it would be done correctly. So they didn't deviate from any of that. They didn't waver any. And you know, it's sad today, so many churches waver and we need to be rooted and grounded on that solid rock. I know our church today is different than the temple, but it's still where we come to worship God. That's what the temple was for. We all should, know and understand that we have a responsibility to God. As a born-again Christian, we have a responsibility to serve Him, to worship Him, to come support our church, to come be here in our worship services and stuff. And that's a responsibility God has given to us as a Christian. And, I was talking with Deborah Brogdon yesterday afternoon. Sonia, I carried Sonia down to Fred's. And the boys were with us, so I told her we'd just sit in the car, and she run in to get what we needed. Deborah was coming out, and she come out to the car. And, I just began to talk with her about some things and about the responsibilities of a Christian. And she was talking about it, and she told me, she said, Brother Clarence, she said, I'd love to be there on Wednesday night. She said, but sometimes I have to work on Wednesday night. She said, sometimes, I've got my grandchildren that I've got to go cook for, whatever, And then she says, on Sundays, she says, I guess, I don't know if she's the one fixing up the schedules, but she's trying to fix it where she can be here every Sunday morning, but then she's working Sunday afternoons, so she can't be here on Sunday nights. And I said, well, I believe God understands, she's the only one working in her family, because her husband passed away. And you know, and I believe God understands things like that. Now, I know just because a person chooses to work on Sunday, you know, I don't think we should do that. That's just my, anybody don't chop my head off, but, you know, because God does want us to be in his house. But, you know, if we don't have a choice, then, you know, it's just like people working in a hospital. I'd hate to know if I'm in there sick as a dog and all my nurses leave on Sunday and ain't nobody there, what we going to do? You know, we're going to be in trouble. So, you know, God understands. And Jesus shared, you know, about if the ox gets in the ditch, to get him out. But I don't find anywhere where he said to put the ox in the ditch so you could get him out, so you could skip church and this kind of stuff. So that's why I say, you know, if a person just chooses to work on Sunday, I don't think they should. I think they should try their best to be in God's house. So, but you know, I don't know. I talked with her about that yesterday and told her, I said, you know, you just got to do what you got to do as far as your job. I said, you got to have a job, and God knows that. I said, I'm thankful you're able to be there when you can be there because of the job she has. So, you know, just pray for her, because she was really concerned about that. But you know, they did keep all the appointments and things that David had set up. And they departed not from the commandment of the king unto the priests and the Levites concerning any matter or concerning the treasures. Now all the work of Solomon was prepared unto the day of the foundation of the house of the Lord, and until it was finished. So the house of the Lord was perfected. So, you know, Solomon was willing to do whatever it took to make sure God's house was completed. You know, even though it took 20 years to build it and his house, and, you know, that's fine, you know. But it's finished, and God was thankful for that. God was pleased with the house that had been built. And, you know, I think it was last week we read that, you know, God shared with them, as long as they would continue to do what they were supposed to do, that he would continue to meet them in that temple. But if they didn't, he said, there'd come a time you won't be in this land, and this temple will be destroyed, basically. And that happened because, you know, as we go on through, we're going to see, you know, people are hard-headed. They were hard-headed then, and they're hard-headed today. I'm one of the worst. You know, I get hard-headed sometimes. And sometimes it's over the wrong things. Now, if I'm hard-headed about this, I'm thankful, because nobody's going to change me about God's Word unless you can show me in God's Word that I'm wrong. Now, if you can show me, if preaching that you hear, whatever, that, hey, Brother Clarence, I just don't know about that. If you can show me in Scripture, then I'll stand up there in front of the church and say, hey, you know what, I was wrong on that. Let's get this correct. I want to make sure everybody knows that, you know, because I don't want to lead anybody wrong. That's one of the biggest fears I have of preaching, is leading somebody wrong. I pray about that all the time. God, help me. You know, but you know, everything was finished and everything was good. Then went Solomon to Ezion Geber and to Eloth at the seaside in the land of Edom. And Huram, it's one of his and his father's friends. And Huram sent him by the hands of his servants ships and servants that had knowledge of the sea. And they went with the servants of Solomon to Ophir, and took thence 450 talents of gold and brought them to King Solomon. So, you know, these people, the Jewish people, are filthy rich. Look, I mean, they're bringing him 450 talents of gold.
86 million.
Yeah, a pile of money. $86 million in the time of Solomon would probably be like 50 billion today, you know, or more. But, you know, Lord have mercy.
And just like he needed it, and all,
Yeah.
he already was filled with
He
it.
was already one of the wealthiest people in the world. He was the wealthiest. Because when, you know, if you remember, God asked him, what would you have me to do for you? He said, just give me the wisdom to judge your people correctly. And God says, because you didn't ask for long life and riches and your enemies to be killed and all these other things, God says, I'm going to bless you with wisdom. I'm going to bless you with all these other things too. And that's why Jesus talks about how that even the wealth of Solomon didn't compare to one of the lilies out there that God creates. You know what? Because, you know, I love to, you know, when the springtime gets here and you start to see these Easter lilies and stuff, and sometimes you can see them little old lilies growing side the road and stuff. Those things are so pretty to me. I love them. You know, I love to see
Not long
that.
you don't start seeing them.
And, yeah, it won't be long. And, you know, Jesus said all the wealth of Solomon doesn't even compare to one of those lilies that God creates. You know, but he was the richest man and the wisest person that has ever been. We think we got some wise ones today, but then sometimes I think, you know, did Solomon drop off with dementia or something? You know, he had about 700 wives.
Hey.
You know, I don't know what happened to him.
Fireworks.
I'm just joking. And it's sad. You know, this is something to me that's sad too, that a lot of churches today think that women are really shouldn't say anything, shouldn't open your mouth at church, sit over in the corner and be quiet. I don't find that anywhere in here. I find God loves women just as good as he loves man. He just gave us different responsibilities. But nevertheless, Solomon, he loved women, and we'll see that before he kicks the bucket. Anybody have anything on any of these verses?